Good morning from Washington, D.C. I'm David Lauder, economics correspondent for Reuters, where I cover the IMF and the World Bank, trade, and other economic issues. We're here with Paulo Mauro, the Deputy Director of the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department, and we're going to talk about the analytical chapter to the forthcoming Fiscal Monitor called Strengthening the Credibility of Public Finances. The backdrop for this chapter is that countries have thrown open their fiscal taps to fight the coronavirus pandemic, some with more resources than others, but the usual sort of fiscal rules have kind of gone out the window. But now we're at a point where I think countries need to start thinking about how they're going to normalize their finances. And I wanted to ask you, Paulo, sort of what does that look like? How should countries be thinking about this? What is normal in a post-pandemic world?
Thank you, David. Yes, indeed. The report that we have just released, as you mentioned, is titled Strengthening the Credibility of Public Finances. And what we find in the report empirically is that if governments can commit credibly to fiscal sustainability, that buys them time and it buys them flexibility at this very difficult period of the pandemic. As you mentioned, during the pandemic, countries around the world have provided massive fiscal support to people and firms. This was very appropriate. Addressing the health crisis was the absolute priority, but that came at a fiscal cost. And the upshot is that government debt globally is now at a historical high, which raises the question, well, do we start stabilizing the debt as a share of the size of the economy? When do we start doing that? Should we reduce the debt ratio? And if so, at what pace? And those are the questions confronting policymakers now. Of course, the answer depends on country circumstances. There will be countries that unfortunately don't have access to financial markets, and therefore they're now making very difficult choices between addressing the health emergency, which they have to do, and unfortunately, what they may have to do is try to save on other types of spending. Whereas in many advanced economies or some emerging markets, the cost of borrowing remains very low, and countries are still able to provide a lot of support to their population. Perhaps even more important is the stage of the pandemic in each country. There are countries where the pandemic is still raging, and therefore the priority continues to be the health emergency. Whereas in other countries, the economy is beginning to pick up, things are beginning to normalize. And in that situation, perhaps countries can start thinking about also gradually reducing the degree of fiscal support that they provide to the economy. What is common to all of these countries is that if they credibly commit to something like a medium-term fiscal framework, and I can elaborate what I mean by that, then markets will reward countries through lower cost of borrowing. Countries can buy themselves a little bit of time by doing so.
Okay. Let's talk about this credible fiscal framework idea. The chapter goes into a fair bit of detail about this. To help maintain investor confidence. What are the ingredients of a credible fiscal framework? And fiscal rules, independent fiscal bodies, how do they play a part? And I guess there's also a trade-off in terms of economic growth. How do you avoid slowing that recovery that is so fragile right now?
Sure. So there are several ingredients to a medium-term fiscal framework, and different countries do this differently. But what's really important is that countries essentially set out a plan in general terms on what are their key fiscal measures over the next 3, 4, 5 years. What is their objective for overall expenditures, overall revenues? What is their target for their fiscal deficit, their fiscal debt? And essentially, it's a way of communicating to the public what their actions are going to be. So more specifically, let me give you a couple of examples of things that countries can do. A country might say, look, we are in the middle of a pandemic. This is not the time to increase taxation yet. But as soon as the recovery is different types of fiscal rules. What we look at, if you want me to give a little bit more detail, is three principles in how countries can design their fiscal rules or their fiscal framework more generally. One is sustainability, the second is simplicity, and the third is stabilization. So sustainability means that countries pick a fiscal target that essentially ensures that their government debt is not going to grow and grow forever. But also important is countries need to pick targets that are both economically and politically realistic, because you want something that is attainable for it to be credible, which is the whole point of the exercise. Simplicity is very important to communicate with the public, to reassure markets, but also to explain to the population at large what the government wants to do. And again, the simple 3% rule is very nice from that perspective. But then there's a third feature, which is perhaps the most challenging, which is the stabilization property of fiscal rules. And that is one where we need to think it's desirable for governments to be able to provide more support to the economy during recessions and perhaps to save a little bit more during economic booms. Just take the example of the pandemic. During the pandemic, many countries that had fiscal rules used escape clauses. They said, this is an emergency, and therefore we are going to have to let the deficits rise very rapidly. That flexibility is very appropriate, but notice that it comes at the cost of simplicity, because once I start putting in these caveats, these escape clauses, I'm going to go a little bit against the principle of simplicity. So what we do in the report is we show all of these trade-offs, and most important, we document that these types of frameworks do have a payoff that governments can benefit from.
Are there any examples in this report about countries that are doing a particularly good job at this? The United States has certainly announced some its intentions to raise more tax revenue, but yet there's political concerns about whether that can be achieved. I mean, who's doing a good job at this?
So we have three pieces of evidence that I want to use to kind of highlight the benefits of these fiscal frameworks and reassuring the public about what's going to happen over the next 3, 4, 5 years. The first one is that countries that have fiscal rules do see that those fiscal rules yield the objectives for which they were intended. So to take an example, we looked at countries where, somewhat surprisingly, all of a sudden the government debt rose. And in the sample we looked at, it rose by 15% of GDP. And we looked at what happens to countries that have a debt rule versus countries that don't. And what we found is that over the next 10 years, gradually, in the absence of additional shocks, those countries that had the debt rule did see a decline back to the starting point, whereas countries that didn't have a debt rule were much slower in going back to the original level, and in some cases did not. So there's a difference. One might argue whether that's really what you need to do, but the point is that the debt rules delivered on the objective for which they were designed. Perhaps even more important, what we find is that countries that have fiscal rules or independent fiscal councils, which are entities that take an independent view on the government's fiscal policies, it's another way of reassuring the public. Countries that have those features have more credibility in the fiscal area. And when I say credibility, the way we measure it is by comparing the fiscal objectives as expressed in official government documents with private sector expectations on the same fiscal variables.
Right. So communicating these objectives and being able to follow through on it and do what you say you're going to do is very important for those investment fund flows. And I guess as we get into a period of higher interest rates, how important is that communication going to be?
Exactly. So yes, indeed, what we find is that there's also a benefit in terms of lower cost of borrowing, which perhaps is what governments really care about. What we find is that countries that have been able, through these institutional fiscal frameworks, countries that have been able to deliver credibility also benefit from lower cost of borrowing. And interestingly, that cost of borrowing becomes particularly low compared with countries that don't have those features at the time of budget announcements. So we really see in the data that countries that have done their homework, if you will, do see benefits in terms of lower cost of borrowing, particularly at the time when they announce a new budget.
Well, I think that's about all we have time for today. But please take a look at the chapter of the Fiscal Monitor, Chapter 2, called Strengthening the Credibility of Public Finances. Paulo Mauro, thank you very much for your time. I'm David Lauder with Reuters. We'll see you at the meetings.